In this video, we'll be teaching you the brimstone smokes, lineups, and positions on Fracture that single-handedly carried me to Immortal. Everything in this guide will only be the must-know knowledge that you need to play brimstone on Fracture. We'll be breaking down each bomb site one by one, starting with the attacking side and then moving on to the defending side. First, let's start off with attacking A site. Every bomb site execute starts from the smokes, so make sure to place your smokes on tower and CT spawn. These smokes are definitely going to be your most common smokes used when attacking A site. However, you should also smoke drop in situations where you don't have any teammates coming from dish. Now, it is very common for defenders to play towards dish, since it gives them a strong position to defend A site whenever attackers exit out of sand in A main. If you happen to be in a different scenario where your team's not opting to push out of sands and instead is only pushing into A site from drop in A main, then you can place your smokes on sand, on top of the sandbox and CT spawn. This wall of smokes is great for blocking not only the vision of sand and CT spawn, but also for any enemies in rafters. Just be wary that the enemies do have a very tiny gap that they can see through. If your team is on a force buy where you have to use weapons like SMGs or shotguns, you can choose to place a smoke drop, and then 2 smokes in the middle of the site, creating a long smoke wall that covers just the bomb site itself. With these smokes, you give up having more space on A site, but instead, you gain the advantage of forcing the enemies to have to play much closer duels, where your weaker weaponry is much stronger. If you're able to achieve this plant spot, try to make your way back to A main so you can abuse these factors. Once you've secured A site, there are a couple plant spots you'll want to choose from. The most ideal is the plant spot under the roofing in this corner. With this spike position, it's pretty easy to hold it from A main due to how visible it is from A main, but also since the spike is planted in the corner, there's less real estate for the defenders to defuse from, making it way easier to spam the diffuser through a smoke. On top of this, here's a lineup for this exact plant position from outside A main. First, line yourself up with this line on the green wall. Then, place the white dot that's on top of your molly shoot element to the bottom of this gray rectangle on the roof. This molly will bounce off the ceiling and cover the plant perfectly. Now, please be careful with this lineup because you're actually too far to hear the spike diffuse. So to play around this, either ask your teammates who are closer to the spike to communicate whether they start to defuse the spike, or shoot the molly early so you can buy yourself time to rotate to either A main or sand. The next best plant position you can get is this open corner plant next to the exit of A main. Similar to the last plant spot, this spike position can easily be held from A main, but also drop. Now, the main drawback of this plant is it's not planted next to a wall, and that gives the defenders the full radius of the spike to defuse, giving them more places to defuse the spike from, and that makes it a bit harder to know where to shoot the diffuser. If you're unable to plant for one of these two positions and are forced to plant near the default pillar, if possible, back away from the pillar and plant closer to the middle or back wall. This will allow your teammates to at least have a line of sight to the spike, rather than having to run out of A main to see it. Here's a lineup for this plant spot if you ever find yourself having to plant here. Line yourself up with this door outside of A main. Then place the left tip at the bottom line of your molly shoot element with the left corner of this metal rod that sticks out of the wall. Similar to the other A main lineup, you're not able to hear the diffuse, so plan accordingly. Now let's move on to how to defend A site, if you're tasked with being the A site anchor. A common position to play is inside A main near this corner. This angle is pretty strong at gaining early info on whether or not the attackers are pushed into A main, but because of this, many attackers will use utility to clear this position, like a breach stun, so be careful when playing here. The main goal of this spot isn't to look for a frag, but to see if they're pushing, and then to fall back onto the site. From here, this is where you would likely throw a smoke onto A main as well as drop if there are enemies coming from dish. If they're heavily committing to A site, then tossing a molly into A main is great at dissuading enemies from pushing through your smoke. Once on A site, you're mainly going to play one of the off angles that the site provides. Here are a couple of off angles that you can choose from. However, you can choose to play these two covered positions, but just be aware enemies are likely to clear these angles. Since A site doesn't have that many positions that you can fall back to reliably, it's mostly choosing which risky angle you want to hold in hopes that you can get 2 frags. Because of this, we recommend adding drop as a position you should try to play. If you can ensure no enemies are approaching from dish, this position provides amazing cover, while also making it hard for attackers to rush you since they have to jump up to clear you. The main concern with this spot is that most of the time it will be smoked, but that's the trade-off for having a safer position. If you aren't tasked with being the A-side anchor, we recommend you play tower. From tower, you have easy access to smoking all the key choke points on A site, such as A main and drop. Hey, you can even smoke the door to sand if you feel like it might be a play from the attackers. With the door, you can go for some tricky plays where you open the door with your own utility, such as your stim or molly, to look for fights with unsuspecting attackers in A main. Cheeky little play you can incorporate into your own gameplay is when you have a shotgun. Place your smoke in the middle of A main like this. Play around the door. This plays incredibly strong at forcing the attackers to have to play in close range duels once they exit the smoke, and using the door as a surprise factor to catch the enemies off guard. The main strength that comes from playing tower is the ability to rotate B site quickly so you can provide assistance with them when they need it. Speaking of rotations, when rotating from A site to B site, make sure to place your smokes onto B main or arcade depending on where the attackers are coming from. As we talked about earlier, playing a position like tower makes it so we can rotate much quicker in order to help our teammates on B site with these crucial smokes. If you rotate to canteen, be prepared to molly B main like so, if the attackers are pushing. This same B main molly can be done from gen as well, but the angle isn't ideal. If the enemies have already taken the B site and now it's a retake situation, smoke B main and arcade like you usually would during your normal rotations. Add a tower smoke in, since this is a common post-plant position. A strength that comes from rotating with gen is you can easily toss a molly onto the safe plant position while they're attempting to plant the spike. All you have to do is shoot the molly so it bounces off the mossy section of the wall next to the slant, and it'll land perfectly onto the enemy planter. Now let's move on to attacking the B side. Whenever you're planning to execute onto B side, always smoke gen and canteen. These areas need to be smoked to isolate the B side players from their teammates who are either playing from gen or canteen, or who are rotating from these places. A very common play for the defenders is to push out these smokes, because it's pretty easy for the defenders to find a frag since the attackers aren't always holding the smokes. If you want to counter this strategy, you can place your molly on top of one of these smokes, to deny the enemy from pushing through without at least taking some damage. An optional smoke you can throw in tandem with the standard smokes is the tower smoke, but this isn't ideal. Allowing the defenders to maintain tower control during a post-plant situation makes it extremely difficult to hold the bomb site afterward. We would recommend taking control of tower with a teammate or with some piece of utility. If your team is rushing B site strictly from either arcade or B main, we highly recommend you smoke the other side of the site that you entered in from, because it's a pretty common play for defenders to push main or arcade so they have more space to defend B side. So, if you enter from only B main, smoke arcade, and vice versa. Now, once you have control of B site, generally there are two main plant spots to choose from. The most ideal is this side of the dice plant. This plant spot's great because it's open to B main as well as tower, so we have multiple options to peek the spike from. If you're personally able to get the spike planted here, try to reposition to B main so you can use this lineup. Place yourself in this corner of the box on B main. Then place the top tip of the little squiggly line of the left line HUD element to where this building meets the mossy wall. This will bounce off the ground once and land perfectly for the dice plant. Although this plant spot is ideal, there's not much cover, so it's quite difficult to plant dice if the enemy's contesting. So our next best plant position is to plant safe and slant. This plant spot is a lot safer than the dice plant, but you might lose the ability to peek the spike from B main. Nevertheless, not all hope is lost if you do have to plant the spike here, because you can hold it from tower pretty well. If you can make your way to arcade after the spike's been planted, we have the perfect lineup for this position as well. Line yourself up with the middle section of this box and arcade, then crouch. While crouching, place the left tip of the line between your stim and molly icon to the right corner of this white tower. This will land right on top of the safe plant, and it even buys you enough time to either route back up tower or wrap from arcade. However, if you find yourself in a situation where you're B main and the spike is planted safe, you can always use this lineup to buy yourself some time. Place yourself into this corner of the boxes in B main. Aim your crosshair at this corner of the wall, then move slightly to the right. This will bounce off the back wall and land on top of the safe plant. Just try to remember though, this is mostly a last resort because of how far you have to move in order to get visual confirmation of the defuse. When defending B site, one of the most powerful positions to play is tower. Tower is a necessary area of the map that attackers have to take in order to have an effective post plant for B site. But they aren't free to just smoke it off, since they're more inclined to push it in some fashion so they can take this space for themselves. If you aren't buying shotguns or SMGs when playing this spot, you're not utilizing the potential of this area to its fullest. With Tower being such a cramped space, these close-range weapons reign supreme at holding this area. Even just having a pocket shorty during your rifle rounds will net some insane value. A good plan to follow is to play this tight angle near Tower stairs, and once you spot enemies pushing from B main, you can smoke and molly, then transition to Tower after. You can even save your molly for when they actually are executing onto the site and use it to deny the attackers from pushing into Tower. Or you can play from Tower at the beginning of the round and jiggle peek arcade to see if they're pushing from there. Then you can fall back and smoke arcade and molly the rope if they begin to push you. Just remember that this smoke does have gaps on both sides and the enemy can peek from above it. Even though Tower is an extremely strong position, the downside is it can easily be neutralized by the attacker's utility. The most obvious examples are Brimstone's ult, Killjoy's ult, and Breach's ult. So always keep tabs on whenever they have utility like these ones. The other positions we suggest Brimstones use are Gen and Canteen. Similar to playing Tower on A side, Gen and Canteen are both close enough to B side where you can smoke the main choke points off for your teammates like B main and arcade, but also have the option to rotate to A side quickly if they need any smokes. From these positions, you can easily molly both B-side chokes as well. Now, the major downside to these spots is they'll always get smoked off. But like we mentioned before, an underrated play is to push these smokes and hope of finding a timing when no one's looking at the smokes. So even when you do get smoked, these aggressive pushes out of the smoke can have some level of consistency to them, especially if you have a teammate nearby that can flash you out of the smoke. And if holding the B side itself fails, do not be afraid to coordinate a push into B main or arcade with your teammates. And it might seem a little risky. The amount of reward you gain is quite substantial, because now if you successfully take that space, the attackers have to deal with one more lane of the map whenever they do a push onto B side. And on top of that, since Fracture's designed to have extremely quick flanks, even if the enemy team isn't poised to go to B side, you can now rotate by flanking, so your entire team isn't funneled into CT spawn and sand. On the topic of rotations, usually when you do rotate from B side, we suggest that you first focus on smoking A main and drop whenever you can to help your teammates on A side. From this point, it's mostly about deciding on if you want to rotate through CT or through Tower. There are a few factors to consider when making this decision. Where are the attackers coming from, and where do your teammates need help? If you rotate through CT spawn, you have the ability to molly the A main choke that leads into A side. You can also immediately fight with your teammates on A site who probably need your help. But please do take into consideration if the attackers have control of sand or not. The main threat that comes with pushing out a spawn is this area right here, where you're simultaneously exposed to sand, drop, and A side. These sand angles are especially dangerous because they establish a strong crossfire for this area. So if there are enemies in sand, we would highly suggest trying to rotate through Tower and clear this area with the help of a teammate. Securing control of sand makes it much easier for your teammates to rotate out of CT spawn, and it gives you access to the door where you can flank A main. And on the topic of flanking, if you're playing B side, attempt to push out a B side and flank dish or A main at least a couple times a half. If the attackers know that all the defenders rotate through CT spawn, they can just play around this and not have to hold their flank. Always try to keep the attackers scared of this threat because of how strong it is, especially on Fracture. Once retake begins, try to use your molly to clear one of the common positions that attackers play on A side. Some great examples of this are mollying the left corner, mollying the top side, or mollying the safe plant pillar. Brimstone's orbital strike has some incredibly strong uses on Fracture. First, let's start off with this Tower ult on B side. Due to how cramped and narrow Tower is, this ult is great at clearing out this must-have position needed for a successful B side post plant. There is one caveat though. With every Brimstone ult, you've got to be prepared to shoot the enemy if they do manage to escape the orbital strike radius. So make sure you've got a long line of sight in both B side as well as this small opening in Tower that dodges the ult. Staying with the theme of B side, an underrated ult spot is ulting slant. This generally is not as strong as the Tower ult, but if you know a defender is playing tucked in this corner waiting for the attackers to scale up to B side, you can use this ult to flush him out. As for A side, our go-to orbital strike is going to be this one, and that covers almost all the site itself, except for the stairs that lead to top side. Anyone on site is forced to run into your teammates or into this small corner that's left open. This might seem a bit annoying, but if you hard clear this corner as you exit A main, it's a pretty advantageous duel for you, especially if you get a teammate to flash or drone the corner. Brimstone, as it stands, is by far the best controller for Fracture.